Okay, we've got a very special show tonight. We've got two lawyers that are going, Gardi and Meda, who are going to give us their impressions of why this bill that Dan is trying to get passed is so dangerous. I'm actually going to pull out because you don't need me doing my little funny things. This is too important. Damien is going to be the host for this. He's much better at this stuff than me. So let's get going. G'day, Damien. Thank Damien. Thanks for a great day yesterday. It was terrific.
Oh, it was brilliant, mate. We haven't had a chance to connect yet. It was so good. It was such a great day.
Yeah, great. Okay, here's Meda. Hello, Meda.
Hi, guys.
Lovely to meet you. And the Golden Gardi.
Hello, everybody. And it was a great day yesterday too.
Hello.
Yeah, it was. I'm going to go move into the background and do the comments. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, guys. It was great to see both of you yesterday. I saw both of you individually yesterday, and it was a great thing. And it was great to talk to both of you as well. And it's sort of like we're at a sort of dire point in Victoria's history as a polity. Daniel Andrews has presented this new legislation, this new pandemic legislation in the lower house. It's been passed on the numbers, of course, and now it's been read for the first time in the upper house. And they've got a couple of weeks until the 16th of this month for everybody to read it and then vote on whether it becomes legislation or not. Now, I know both of you have gone over it with a bit of a fine-tooth comb, with a legal mind, much better than mine, of course. And so I'd just like to get either of you to just tell us what your initial thoughts are on this bill.
Okay, so thanks very much, Damo. Let's get into it. Now, we've got many thousands of people listening here tonight, many thousands, and we know that. And we also know that most people are not legally trained. So we're going to tell you some aspects of this bill and going to put it in pub language, plain street talk, so you understand in the most basic way, none of this legal bullshit that lawyers like to talk. We'll talk straight down the line. So let's just get started. What we're going to do is I'll go through various sections of the Act, and then Meta will jump in and we'll bounce off each other with our comments about that, and Damo will steer us to make sure we're in the right direction. So let's start off with the beginning. So it says, first of all, in the Act, and it's 165AB, never mind the number. It says the Premier may make a declaration, which is called a pandemic declaration. So whoever the Premier is, in this case it's Andrews, he can make a declaration. When can he make a declaration? Two situations. He can make a declaration arises from a pandemic disease. That's the word, a pandemic disease. Or the alternative is a disease of pandemic potential. So, and that's the first slippery slope, a disease of pandemic potential. Because the question is, what is a pandemic disease? Well, the common flu is a pandemic disease if you want to analyze it. And here, nothing is analyzed in this legislation about what makes for a pandemic disease. But the flu is a pandemic disease. So that already gives him the trigger. But let's say that isn't the case. He can then go to a potential. So, for example, if there is a breakout of something in some backwater in Africa, he can say that that's a potential, and he can then trigger the declaration for a pandemic disease. When he does that, what he has to do, it doesn't matter, by the way. The legislation clearly says it doesn't matter that Victoria is not actually affected. The validity of the actual declaration is unaffected by the fact that nothing is happening in Victoria. So for example, if we're in Australia and we're in Victoria and we are all healthy and well, and as I said, a village in the backwaters of Africa, there's a potential that something will flow from there. It doesn't matter. We're still locked down. Okay, I think I'll just stop there and throw it over to Meta on this point. Meta.
Yes, thanks, Gardi. So, I think what it does, obviously, it makes provisions for the future. But in my mind, what's happening now is that we have been promised numerous times there's not going to be any more lockdowns. There's going to be, if anything, very targeted things happening that, we are going to sort of get back to whatever the next normal is going to be. But given that, we've got this now piece of legislation in front of us, essentially, for as long as there is COVID anywhere in the world,
Correct.
essentially, and I'm not even talking about future potentially, pandemic causing diseases. I mean, this is the reality we're facing right now. And I know a lot of people are kind of, like everybody really, over what's happening, and they want to look forward, they want to look into the future. I mean, the reality is COVID is still going to be around well into 2022.
No different to HIV. It's been around for the last 40 years.
Absolutely. But, let's bring it back into the context of COVID, because we were promised that, that's it for lockdowns and things like that. Well, the legislation has a very, very low threshold, as you pointed out, right? So we don't even need some, disease in Africa. I mean, the fact that COVID is still around already triggers that section. So we're talking about the very, very foreseeable future. It's not something, we're
not talking about something that might happen.
Yes, that's right. So really looking into 2022, if this legislation is passed and it comes into force on the 16th of December, we are still going to be living under a pandemic declaration, because we've got COVID around.
For years.
And and that will then trigger all of the other things.
And just on that point, what subsection 4, just for the purposes of the listeners, and the viewers, we're talking here about the triggering mechanism of a pandemic declaration. That's all we're talking about at the moment. And subsection 4 of that particular trigger says that it doesn't even matter if there is no serious risk. Even if there's no serious risk, even if it's a dormant risk, that is a triggering mechanism for the Premier, and it's only the Premier, to then declare a lockdown, and not only a lockdown, but declare all the things that we're going to talk about in a moment.
Yes. So 0 cases, 0 hospitalizations, 0 deaths, irrelevant.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah, we've already seen that, haven't we? We've already seen that to some extent, because I remember last year when there was 5 cases, it was, oh my God, let's lock down quick. This is terrible. Yeah. Suddenly there's over 2,000 cases in the community, and it's okay. You're allowed to go to the races. That's
right. And that's part of the stupidity of the whole thing. But let's not get sidetracked with that, because the people will then start to think that we're all just political about it. Right? But the legislation now says you can have a pandemic declaration made. Doesn't matter if it's real, a serious risk, or if it's not a risk or non-existent risk. If the Premier thinks that it should be done, it is done. And so in the case of COVID-19, I don't even call it COVID-19, by the way. I call it the CCP flu. But anyway, in the case of COVID-19,
because you don't want to be political.
No, but I can't help it. In the end of the case of COVID-19, it runs indefinitely, and it can continue on and on and on.
What sort of oversights are there on him being able to declare this emergency pandemic? What sort of oversights are there in this legislation?
Oh, we're going to come to that. We'll come to that in a second.
Yeah.
Okay, now continuing on with this pandemic declaration, another section, 165 AC, all these numbers. It says that the declaration must not exceed a period of 4 weeks. So if somebody tells you, oh yeah, but the declaration's only going to stand for 4 weeks, it's not the end of the world, right? No, it goes on to say, but it may be extended under subsection 165 AE. Well, let's just have a look at 165 AE. What does it say? And 165 AE says the Premier may vary or extend the pandemic declaration if the Premier is satisfied that there continues to be a serious risk to public health. So if Dan decides in his own wisdom that,
or any other Premier, sorry to butt in, other Premier in future,
And the question of let's just pause here as lawyers. When it says the person has to be satisfied that there continues to be some sort of a serious risk, the first question I ask myself is, what are the criteria for the person to be satisfied? What are the tripwires for somebody to say, I'm satisfied of this, of this, of this, of this? None of that is defined in here. We don't know what he's satisfied with. He can be satisfied because he had a bad Chinese dinner and he's got indigestion. Nothing is given as the criteria for satisfaction, and then nothing is defined as serious risk. What is a serious risk? To me, I like to motorcycle. That means I'm a serious risk taker, but I don't see myself as a risk taker. I see myself as a risk manager. There are friends of mine who like to jump out of aeroplanes, but there are other friends of mine who are so gutless they will stay indoors at every opportunity. So what's a serious risk to the public? It ought to be defined. It's also not defined.
Yeah.
Over to you, Mena.
Yeah, look, I totally agree with everything that you said. I think the problem there is that it's being left in his hands, in the Premier's hands, to essentially just make a blanket decision without the need to consult with anybody, and also not having anybody being able to scrutinize that decision. And,
That's
you know,
right.
there is no accountability under the bill, and there is no way to challenge that decision.
And Damo, I don't know if it's starting to come across, but what we're going through the tripwires, and what we're showing is that each time it's very vague, very broad, and there's no checks and balances as we go along with this. So I hope that's coming through with what
Do you think that's deliberate, or do you think that's incompetence?
Oh, that's absolutely deliberate. It's in the legislation in black and white. I'm reading it from the legislation. It's deliberate.
Yeah, Damon, if they wanted to make the legislation specific, they would have done so. You know, this is not by coincidence that this has happened the way it's happened, and also, you know, I'm under the impression, just reading into things, that this, you know, and I think Fiona Patten has actually come out and confirmed that this legislation's been discussed and negotiated since at least May this year. So this is not a new document that has now all of a sudden, you know.
Let's be clear about this. To the
25,000 people amassing on the steps of Parliament House.
Let's be clear for our viewers that when the politician in power, the government in power, decides to pass to get bills, they go to their parliamentary council, which are basically lawyers that sit there on the floor of Parliament with their wigs and gowns, and they write up these things. And when they write up these things, like any lawyer, they go to their client, in this case it's the Premier and Cabinet, and they ask, well, what do you want? Tell us what you want. And then they draw it accordingly. So this has been drawn to instructions by the government, right? It goes on then to say, it says that it doesn't matter, subsection 1 applies whether or not at the time of the variation or extension the disease is present in Victoria. So after 4 weeks, it doesn't matter if there's no disease in Victoria. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. He can just extend ad infinitum because he considers it appropriate in his own wisdom to do so.
So there's no limit on that. He can just keep extending by 4 weeks.
He can do it forever. Yeah. And then speaking of that, let me go on. Subsection 5 goes on to say, and listen to this one, you're going to love this, viewers. There's no time limit on the number of times a pandemic declaration may be extended under subsection 1. How black and white is that? There is no time limit on the number of times a pandemic declaration may be extended. It can be extended forever. That's what it's saying.
And this is because there was 890 people that's allegedly died of the coronavirus.
No, we don't need any deaths. We don't need any deaths.
We don't need any of that.
No, but I'm saying this legislation is a response to that. This legislation is in response. That would be his excuse. Well, I'm doing this to protect the community.
He will say something along those lines, and he will use all his usual spin. But the real reason will come out later. We'll get to the real reason. We can discuss that later. Okay, so we've spoken about the declaration, we've spoken about the triggering mechanism and the fact that he can drag it on ad infinitum, which is a Latin way of saying forever. Then I'm just flipping down. Now, what he's going to do, once he's made the declaration, the next step for the Premier is that he must report to Parliament about the declaration. And that's section 165 AG. So he reports, and what it says is this, number 1, if a pandemic declaration is made, varied, extended, or revoked, the Premier must prepare a report in accordance with this section. And what is the report he's got to do? So every time he rolls over the declaration, he has to prepare this report. and he's got to give the reasons for making that decision. Now, the reasons it doesn't say what he has to say in the reasons. It doesn't define. You've got to, when you give your reasons, when you explain your reasons, you must address the following issues: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. None of that applies. All he has to say is, if you're going to be mischievous, I extend it because I think that there is a risk to the community, and I think that this is in the communal interest. That's it. He's explained his reasons. Then he's got to supply a copy of the advice he's received from the Minister of Health. It doesn't say which minister, but it just says the minister. That's subsection. That's subsection. Hang on, 1B. 1B. It says a copy of the advice of the minister and chief health officer in respect of making that decision. So, for example, you'll go to the health minister, who will just say exactly the same, and you'll go to the chief health officer, who will say exactly the same again. And remember,
you say, do you want to keep your job?
Right. That was you stuck the words out of my mouth. The chief health officer is employed by him. He's not going to do anything to say to the contrary. Aside from that, since when do we give such ultimate power to somebody who's unelected? I mean, we can sack Dan Andrews technically at the poll at the voting booth, but the chief health officer is completely unelected. He's unaccountable to anybody. He can do whatever he wants.
It's happening all over the Western world.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
And can I just can I just say, in relation to that, that is the point that is being sold to us, in inverted commas, that provides for greater transparency than what we've had in the past. So that is the point where we all should go, yippee, we're loving this piece of legislation because this effectively binds the executive to be more transparent with us. Now, I have two thoughts about that. One is that under our Public Health and Wellbeing Act, they are required to table all of their advice in Parliament anyway. That's number one. So there is no change there. And
to add any more, then why are we changing it? That's the first question we ask ourselves.
And then also, the other question is, we are being shown the advice that we being the executive chooses to show us, but then, and I'll hand over to Gadi, there is absolutely no scrutiny of that, or no mechanism in the bill to allow for Parliament to scrutinise the advice, and then there is, so effectively we're being shown it, whatever that it may be, that the government of the day chooses to show us, and we are being shown it, and we can read it, and then we can go home, and that's it.
And lump it. Okay, so let's just pick it up from there. So you've made a declaration because you think you in your unfettered discretion, you think you can make one. Doesn't matter if there's any disease around or not, you can make it. All you have to do is give a statement of reason, and no one tells you what you have to address in your reasons, so you can say anything you want. And of course, the people who you rely on are the people who you employ, so they're going to do what you say. And then here's the doozy, subsection 6. It's a beauty, this one. I've never seen anything like it. It says, a failure to comply with the requirement of this section in relation to a report in respect of making a variation, extension, or revocation of a pandemic declaration does not affect the validity of the declaration. So, for example, if he has made a declaration and he forgot to send that to make the report to Parliament, doesn't matter. It doesn't affect the declaration. Or if he gave a declaration and the reasons he gave by accident was, I got drunk last night, doesn't matter. It's like a get out of jail card, no matter what has happened. I've never seen that in any piece of legislation before in my life.
No, it's outrageous.
It's outrageous. That's the same with vaccines, isn't it? That big Pfizer, big pharma have gotten away with it. They're not accountable for any of it. So it's like the elites are making themselves more and more unaccountable to law, and we're being held more and more account to any draconian measure that they might care to introduce.
That's right. And then goes on. Then he talks about pandemic orders. We've talked about the declaration. The emperor premier makes the declaration, and then it gets handballed to the Minister of Health, and the subsection, Division 3 of the Act talks about pandemic orders. So the Premier hands it over to the Minister of Health, who then is the hatchet man. He does the orders. And it's exactly the same. The minister can make it says the minister may at any time on or after the making of the pandemic declaration make any order, and that's called a pandemic order, that the minister believes is reasonably necessary to protect public health. So once Dan Andrews has said that there is a potential for a pandemic because something has arisen, or just because he says so, then the Minister for Health is then able to start making orders accordingly, called pandemic orders. What he believes is reasonably necessary. Doesn't tell us on what basis he believes it's necessary and what is reasonable or not reasonable. It's just that he believes it. That's it. So, and then what it goes on to do is to say,
sorry, Gary, if I can butt in there. So the issue that, with whether or not he believes it's reasonably necessary to protect public health, from a legal perspective, the threshold is so low, it makes it practically impossible to challenge. So
that's right.
All you need is somebody's subjective view, and then there you've got it. You've got the order. You can't challenge that order on its merits because, what is reasonable to one person is...
But they haven't defined the criteria of what makes for reasonableness, so they can do whatever they want.
Yeah. So essentially the bill doesn't spell out what, or doesn't establish what's the legal unreasonableness that you could challenge the order on.
Right.
So it's overreach, absolute overreach.
Well, it's another way of saying you have a power, and we're not going to tell you. We're not going to define the gates that you have to walk through in order to exercise that power. You can just have it because there it is. Go and do what you want. That's what it's doing. And then it goes on.
Yeah.
This is investing more and more power in the state constantly.
Totally. And this is now. Here comes to your question about the powers, the orders. Okay, so these pandemic orders. First of all, in subsection 2A, it says that those powers are not limited to. Now, let me just pause and explain this legal terminology. Without limiting subsection 1, a pandemic order may include, but is not limited to, and it lists a whole bunch of orders. That's another way of saying your pandemic order, the power of your order, is as broad as you like. We're giving you a list, but that list doesn't limit you. It's just examples. You can do anything you want. So that's another example of the widest.
Pointless having the list in a way, isn't it?
It's a useless list. The reason why they put this in the list here is to dispel any idea that anybody has that, I shouldn't be detained. No, it says not only are you going to be detained, but more. Let's go through it. First of all, persons are going to be detained in a pandemic management area, right? So you're going to be detained. And you're going to be detained in a pandemic management area. Well, that's it. There's your camps right there. I don't have to go beyond as you can. And all you're going to do is the conditions of the, if the conditions of the order are satisfied, so you create the order, you create the what you consider as the reasons for the order, and then you can round people up and detain them, and then
you can restrict movement.
Oh, we get to that. Yep. Hang on a second. That requires if all you're going to do is you've got to think. The minister has to think that the detention of people is something that he considers reasonable for whatever reason it is. Next section, he can restrict movement. So anyone's movement can be restricted. Anyone for any reason.
Any reason.
That's subsection C. And that includes, it says also requires movement into or from a pandemic management area. So getting in and out of that, you won't be visiting your kids if they're in one of those camps. You can't go out. No one goes in, no one goes out. They can do what they want. It prevents or limits entry to a pandemic management area. Now here's the doozy. I love this one. It's just incredible. It prohibits or regulates gatherings, whether public or private. Now, just imagine that. There'll be no more demonstrations. A demonstration is considered a gathering. So that's the end of that.
But then private gatherings, private gatherings.
Forget it. You're in forget anything. Goes on. Requires the use. Anything that requires they can determine the requirement for the use of personal protective equipment. If they decide, it's not just a case of wearing a mask on your face. They can go all the way. You have to wear triple masks. You have to wear special glasses. You have to run around with rubber gloves. You have to wear a gown. You have to change it every day.
Remember the boy in the bubble when he was in the bubble? Because
everything. Yeah. It's
Howard Hughes. He's a great example of someone who never wanted any germs to go anywhere near him.
Personal protective equipment. It's just incredible. They don't define what it is and for how long and for who. It goes on. It prohibits or regulates carrying on of activities, businesses, or undertakings. Carrying on of activities. Think about that. You can't. I mean, does that include, for example, political parties? Does that include anyone who has a view that's counter to him? Does it include, or does it just include Collingwood supporters because we don't like Collingwood supporters? What does it actually include? Meta, over to you.
Wow. Activity. What is activity? I mean, all of the things, we don't even have to think that far back. So we tick those activities, right? There's not going to be any community sport for children. There's not going to be any swimming lessons for children. There's not going to be anyone playing golf because that's, potentially a risk.
Civil liberties. Think of your don't. Let's not think about all the fun activities in life. Think of your day-to-day civil liberties. You can't gather with friends because you're considered to have the wrong view, and that's considered a gathering. Imagine that. You can't. Just think of that. You can't go to a picture theatre because not a picture theatre. You can't go to a play because the playwright's story might be considered subversive, and all the people there are considered subversive just by listening to it. That
not
is
a government-funded play. It won't. I can guarantee you that. That's almost a waste of time.
It goes on. It then talks about, if they feel that you require a medical examination or testing, they're obliged to force you to do that. They can force you to have a medical exam. And medical exam can be anything. It can be internal, digital, right? Or testing of a person. What does testing mean? They can strap you up and draw blood from you. They can do anything they want. Once you've lost, let's be clear here, guys. Once you have lost sovereignty of your body, you've got nothing left. It's no longer my body, my choice. I choose the vax or not. It's they can take you and do anything they want with you, and they'll detain you for it.
For the good of public health. That's what they're saying. That's what they're letting.
In their reasonable opinion.
And it's like they've been acclimatizing us to this for the last 2 years, basically, and now this is like the consolidation of that.
Absolutely,
And this is not even consolidated. No, this is taking it up 10 notches. Like what we've had in the past is nothing. Doesn't even come close to this.
It's times 1,000. They also are. They're allowed to quarantine. They're allowed to destroy. There's quarantining, destruction, or management of disease vectors. Right, so they can come along and they can destroy, and vectors are considered animals. They can come along, they'll take all your livestock and destroy it. Your dog, your dog is a problem. We'll destroy your dog as well. Your cat. They're allowed to do that.
Well, it also talks about provision of information, right? That you can be compelled to provide information. Now, this is not limited to medical information, and it's not limited to that deliberately. I mean, we are. We're talking pandemic management here. Why do we need any information? Why do we need to make it that broad?
Meta, flesh out to our listeners, viewers, what you mean about harvesting of information. Let's just be clear about that.
Well, the bill allows for the provision, or for them to require you to provide information, right?
Any information.
So information can be anything. Information can be relation.
You don't have a right to silence anymore. That old cherished thing.
You can have a right to silence, but you'll be gathered up and detained until you change your mind.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
you basically lost it by coercion. They can ask you anything. They can ask you who you sleep with, when you last had sex. They can ask you who you vote for, anything.
How
So
many zeros have you got in your bank account? Who did you last vote for? You know, what sexual orientation, if, you know, they consider that relevant to public health.
Yep.
Anything.
They've got
And
other
here's the
legislation before the Parliament have made for accessing our digital accounts. Is that not right? I think there is more further legislation.
There's it's a separate bill. It's kind of like an extension to this, where they can take, essentially what they're seeking to do is take the information that they already hold and circulate it, so they don't have to ask for that, but they can ask us for everything else that they don't have.
So we've talked about the declaration, pandemic declaration, the triggering mechanisms, and how that's scrutinized, and it's not. We've talked about the pandemic order, how that's how that is implemented, the implications of the implementation, and then here comes the next one, 165AJ. This is incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Pandemic orders prevail over other subordinate instruments. Now, for plain English, what that means is this legislation, this bill, overrides every other piece of legislation. So don't come to court saying, hang on, Your Honour, this doesn't apply because Human Rights Act says this and the other act says that and Equal Opportunity says the other. No, none of it applies. This clearly says this is the pinnacle of all legislation in Victoria. That is, again, I've never seen anything like this before.
This is why they did the mother of all propaganda campaigns to scare the living bejesus out of every citizen constantly on the television with this just fear porn about this virus and how horrific it was going to be, how it was going to be millions of us basically dead in the street, so as cover to bring in this legislation.
Yeah, that's right. I agree. That's it. If you want somebody to do something, scare them. Then it goes on. You talked about who's going to be affected. It talks about this: to whom Section 165AK, to whom a pandemic order applies. So who do you think it applies to? First of all, it applies to all persons, everybody, right? Secondly, this is subsection B. It applies to specified classes of person.
Yes, yeah.
I'll come to that. Specified classes of person.
This is the characteristics
and C, a specified person, individual. Now, what is a classes of persons? Well, that's not defined per se in the Act. But let me tell you that if you know anything about world history, I'm just trying to find here. I had the definition of classes of person in my hand. Look. You've heard about critical race theory. You've heard about gender theory. You've heard about so many of these theories. Look, if you are black, you are a class. If you are gay, you are a class. If you're a Jew, you're a class. If you're a Muslim, you're a class. If you are poor, you're a class. If you are a person who has capital and are considered under Marxism to control the means of production, that's a class. He basically can decide classes on society. The minister, the premier, with the health minister will decide who the classes are. It's literally dividing society into classes, and there will be class warfare now as a result. Meta.
Yes. Look, to me, that is one of the most outrageous sections, I have to say. I have huge problems with all the others, but this is one that is literally a slap in the face to every Victorian, every Australian, and every single person that has now fought for decades to, bring about acceptance and equality in society and to mend wrongs in the past and to heal wounds. And then to have this in a piece of legislation is appalling. To literally, allow what we are saying, and like I said to Gardy today, this is normalizing and legitimizing and in fact legalizing discrimination. That's all it is.
Well, I'll tell you what, if you have if any of your viewers have any doubt about me or Meta being hysterics, just Google yourself the words What is classes of person? Google that up, and it'll tell you that what is meant by classes of person: a group of persons sharing a similar social, political, and certain economical, political, and cultural characteristics.
Yeah.
That's racism, out and out racism. In Marxist theory, it's a group of persons sharing the same relationship to the means of production. But this is not Marxism. We're talking about, economic, political, cultural characteristics. I'm just horrified. I'm completely horrified when I see
but
stuff
it's
like
wokeism,
that.
isn't it? It's wokeism on steroids. So suddenly it's a coverall for all the identity politics that Daniel Andrews and the Labor Party in particular have played over the years, and offering selected groups sort of privilege because they've allegedly, etc. But suddenly, this covers all of that. This covers all of that.
All of it. And more.
It doesn't matter what race, what gender, whatever you are, this actually collectivizes us all again and trumps all of the identity politics that we have seen playing out in our culture for decades now.
And it goes even further. Then he talks about specified persons. Now, it doesn't define what it means, but I'll tell you what it can mean. Anybody, for example, in the Liberal Party, anybody who's on the crossbench can be specified persons because they disagree with what he says. That's how far this can go. Make no mistake about it. He can round up his political opponents with that.
And also, can I butt in and say that under this section, he can change his mind every day about classes, about how orders apply to those classes. One minute you can be in favor, the next minute you're going to be detained for the same reasons that you were in favor yesterday. So there is no, it's unspeakable what this section. I just
hang on.
You grew up in Ceausescu's Romania, didn't you?
Yes. Yeah.
So does this remind you of your experiences there?
Oh, absolutely. Look, I was born during the communist regime. I, spent my childhood there, and I saw how it can actually pan out for when you place so much power in the hands of, in the hands of a few people. Really, I can't even call it the government because it wasn't even the government. And this is what this bill is seeking to achieve as well. I mean, it specifically singles out, two people, and that is the Premier and the Health Minister. We're not talking about government. We're not talking about the cabinet. We're talking about two people here. And that frightens me. And then to read this stuff and, whoever is in favor at any given moment is great. And then the next minute that person can fall out of favor and be reprimanded and detained and have all sorts of things imposed on them. This is history repeating itself for me, really, what I saw in Romania.
It goes further with that, because then it talks about 165.3. It goes about if you have characteristics, attributes, or circumstances. That's the words: characteristics, attributes, or circumstances. That is like you might as well round up the Jews tomorrow. And by the way, Damo, my parents were Holocaust survivors, right? My family were all exterminated in gas chambers. So I understand what characteristics, attributes, and circumstances mean intimately, right? So it goes on. And I'm looking at the clock. We're not even halfway through this bill. Not even halfway. I'm not kidding. It gets worse.
We might have to have part two. If we have to have part two, we will have part two.
The part two is once you're rounded up, how do you get out of being rounded up? And basically what you've got to do is they've got to reassess you every day. You can put in a complaint. You have to do it in writing. What happens is that your warden then looks at it. He makes a decision. He sends it off to the chief health officer, who makes another decision. And that's the end of it. And that's all you can do. You can't do anything. You
re-education camp.
You're in there permanently. You're going nowhere until they feel otherwise, and not until they think you've changed your mind. And it then comes the punishments, monetary punishments. That's the next section, and that is that if it's one thing if you don't follow the rules, there are a certain number of penalty points, which amounts to a certain amount of money that you get punished for. But if you are considered somebody who should have known better, I'm using now plain language because it's too far down the act. We're running out of time. If you've done something And if the machine says you should have known better, you are then considered to be in the heinous department, and you get 10 times worse punishment than everybody else. So you, Damo, would be considered.
And what does it mean you should have known better? Why would you be someone
well,
that should know better?
the words used are not known better. I'll try and find it for you. I'm flipping here as I'm talking to you. I'm looking. Meta, fill up the space.
I'd say, were you concerned, Meta? Because when Daniel Andrews came into office, I think it was like 2014 when he came into office, he instituted the Ministry of Equality. Now that read alarm bells for me because it came straight out of George Orwell. There'd never been a Ministry of Equality in Australian political history. It was a bureaucracy devoted to equality. Martin Foley, he's now health minister, must be his go-to man, headed it up. So when you heard that, what some of this come from that communists where they talk about nebulous terms like equality, which could mean whatever you want it to mean, which always means something draconian to the culture.
Yeah, the guy's a lunatic. Damo, it's insane. The power of detention includes the power to transport you to other places. Transport you to other places. I'm thinking of cattle cars now. They can transport you. The visions that I have are just outrageous. They can not only collect you, forget Mickleham, they'll transport you in the dead of night to wherever they want to transport you. And I'm looking here now again, still looking, I'm flipping down. There's going to be a review by a detention review officer. That's the warden, who then go to the CHO. And I'm getting, it's just incredible.
The detention review officer.
Yeah, yes. Detention review officer. Yeah.
Wow, what a title.
And he will then go to the chief health officer.
Applying for that job.
If you're still, here it is. 1 second. Detention.
I worked as a PSO for a while. I might go for the detention review officer role.
Yeah, but also the detention review officer is not defined. I mean, what type of qualifications does that person have to have? Like, who is that person? Who's going to appoint that person? Is this going to be just...
They'll be the
zealots. Can help, I think.
The people, the zealots who... These officers who will be doing all this work will be all the zealots who follow the narrative, who want to do it. All the thugs and all the mugs, the brown...
I've already felt this thing. They're everywhere. I've felt this thing already.
In answer to your question, a natural person gets fined 120 penalty points, whereas if it's your company, it's 600 points. But then there is the aggravated offence of failure to comply with an order. And a person is considered to have committed an aggravated offence here is the words, if the person knows or ought to know that the failure to comply is likely to cause a serious risk. So if you...
could I just stop you for a second? Because I want to ask you about the penalty points, because that's not a financial punishment. That's penalty points. Is that an introduction to a social credit score? Has that, if they look at it?
Well, go on, Meta. It's all yours.
Sorry, no. Look, we've all through legislation we've had this system for a long, long time. So we talk about penalty units, and the penalty units are defined, and they're changing them every so often and things like that. So it's really nothing new. That didn't really raise any alarm bells with me. The aggravation aspect, that raises alarm bells with me, because again, it's incredibly broad. I mean, you ought to have known that.
Ought to know, whatever ought to know means. I don't know what ought to know.
Yeah,
and you get 2 years imprisonment.
That's something that you were or were not doing, might constitute a risk to public health. Now, he's giving the orders. I mean,
we're not to public health. The risk of another individual. If you risk another individual, that's the words that are used here. Yes. The health of another. If you risk the health of another individual, then you are, and you should have known, you're going in for 2 years jail. That's what it means.
And is that because of that they feel threatened, like that?
I don't know. It's not defined. It's not explained. Not explained.
There's no reasonable grounds that you would have been threatened. It's just I felt threatened.
Not explained.
He put his bin out. He didn't have a mask on.
No, not explained.
Right.
Not explained.
I think we all know, because we've seen the legal process go that way over decades now. So that's where it's going to be.
But you see, a judge sitting on the bench has to define this. The judge sitting on the bench has to define this, and if it's undefined, he has to, by law, say, "I give it the broadest definition." I'm sorry, I can't. I'd love to help you, but I can't. I'm giving it the broadest definitions, and you're screwed, mate. Bad luck. That's what's right. Okay, those are the issues that I wanted to raise from the actual act tonight. That's quite a lot to think about for people. What I want to end off by myself saying, and I throw it to you guys, is anybody out there, if you think that you are safe, if you think that you can sit at home, that you can go to your restaurant at night, go to a movie, go to the pub, and you're safe, I'm telling you, you're fooling yourself, because it will get to you, it will get to everybody. And by the time it gets to you, it will be too late. This is the greatest overreach in law that I've ever seen. It is tantamount to unfettered dictatorial power in the hands of one person who can do anything he wants. He can even suspend elections if he wants to. He can round up political opponents, suspend elections. He can do anything. Or she, whoever the premier is. It is no better than living in China. It's that simple. You might as well be living in China or North Korea.
So what chances do we have of defeating this?
Meta, it's over to you.
The Assistant Attorney General came out the other day, Amanda Stoker, and said if the federal government wants to, it can legislate against Andrews being able to bring in this legislation. We're holding a lot of hope, are we, in the Morrison?
No. Look, personally, I don't think so. And I saw something else on somewhere, I can't remember. I think it was on Sky News, where it kind of was a follow-up interview by the Assistant Attorney General, and she said that yes, they could intervene, but it's not desirable for the federal government to intervene. My issue with that, and look, I totally agree. I mean, we have the system that we have for a reason. I do believe that, the states should be doing their best work, and this should be putting their best foot forward, and should be held accountable for the decisions that they make and all of that. Now, I don't find it desirable, for example, for the federal government to intervene when, those matters go directly to sort of, state-related matters. Now, effectively, though, what we're going to see with this bill, if it goes through, is that I think this unfettered power that the Premier gets is essentially really segregating Victoria from the rest of the country. I don't think the federal government can in good conscience sit back and say, oh, we'll let it go to the next, to the next election. People can take it out of the ballot box. Because, as Gadi said, there is nothing in this bill that will stop, the Premier from suspending or postponing elections indefinitely. So people are not going to actually have the opportunity to hold the government to account for their actions. So,
Meta, you said we had the system we've got for a reason, right? So you're saying that you don't think that the Fed should stick their noses into a state issue.
Look,
we don't have the system, do we, that we've got? Because hasn't Andrews been served with a writ for, and you'll know this language better than me.
Forget this writ for the moment. That writ is a red herring.
Reason, though?
No, it's not. It's a red herring. But what I want to say to you about, look, most people who ask me on the street, I've had so many questions on Saturday about this. They all seem to think that the federal government is somehow over and above state, and therefore they have power over the state. That is not so. The Constitution is an act of Parliament. Like this bill, it's an act of Parliament, and it defines the powers of the states versus the powers of the federal government. The only way the federal government's going to intervene about anything to do in Victoria, any act of Parliament in Victoria, is if that act of Parliament contravenes some power that the federal government has under the Constitution Act, okay? So, for example, if Andrews decided tomorrow to start raising income tax, the federals would go to court because the Constitution Act says only the Commonwealth can raise income tax. You see what I'm saying? So this is a law that talks about management of health situation within the state, and therefore ScoMo doesn't have any power. The only window that ScoMo potentially might have was in relation to mandates where people are forced to take the jab. In other words, the circumstances are created that if they don't take their jab, they lose everything, their livelihood, everything else, which therefore is a form of conscription. It's an indirect form of conscription, which under section, I think it's 51A, 23A or something, you can't do that. You can't have medical conscription. The Commonwealth, the constitutions and cases are clear. You can't have medical conscription. And the argument is...
start locking people up in camps and the Prime Minister can say, well, I don't have any powers.
That's right. That's a possibility.
Exercise
right.
The change that's occurring down there in Victoria.
Yeah, that's a theoretical possibility. But will he do it? I doubt it. But anyway.
Yeah. But going back to the question of what can we do? So I don't rely too much on the federal government intervening, unfortunately, in this instance. I don't think they will. But I think, generally speaking, it's not done until it's done. I know that we are.
Instance would they then?
I think
if they weren't on this one, I mean, is there one they would intervene on? I mean, he shot people on the shrine.
Yeah.
That didn't happen. Morrison was overseas basking in the glory of what a great pluralist society Australia was at that particular point in time. Anyway, sorry, Meta, keep going. I can't help it to interrupt.
Look, I think there is. I think there is still time. I think we are being told. I saw another reporter last night. I think it was on Channel 9 who was telling us again that it's the deal is done. It's as good as passed. And that's kind of been the narrative all along ever since, they've come out with it. That to me sends the message that don't bother, people don't bother, just forget about it. It's a deal. It's a done deal. And every time I hear that, I think, why am I being told that?
It's not.
Because, and not necessarily because it's not. Look, I'm sure that, deals have been done and, things have, have been arranged and negotiated and things like that with the key people. But I think people need to understand that until this bill gets, royal assent, it's not done. And until such time
to make us think about it. But let me also explain one other thing. People that keep asking why, for example, has Fiona Patton, who I believe is from the Sex Party, correct me if I'm mistaken, why is she so
Reason?
Reason Party.
Reason. The name Reason. She's renamed the party. Yeah.
Okay, call it the Reason Party, but I would have called it the Sex Party. Okay, that's fine. Let me tell you, there is a bill. There is a bill that's going to go in front of the council at the same time as this particular bill that we're talking about. And if you need, I'll give you the name of the bill. But it's to do with the sex issue, the Sex something or other Discrimination Act. I can't remember its name. And that bill is designed to do something very specific, and that is to decriminalise sex workers. But it goes a step further because sex workers were decriminalised about 25, 30 years ago when brothels became legal. What it does is it says that sex workers can now operate from home. They can operate from their car, from their caravan. They can advertise. So in other words, just to put it in plain language, if you happen to live in Elstonwick, some little quiet street or other, and your neighbour decides to take up sex work and run a brothel from her home or from his home, whatever it may be, they can do it. That's it. Now, imagine how many mums and dads out there who are conservative people who will take objection to that. You want to have a brothel? Yeah, we're happy to have a brothel. But you have to have it in designated areas. That's the law in Australia, in Victoria.
Not in your Volkswagen. Yeah.
But designated areas, they're always designated areas. They're well protected. They're well shielded and covered. In other words, the theory goes we want to protect the fabric of the community and the children, all the rest of it, right? And now you can have it. You can have it next door to a school. You can have it in your backyard. It doesn't matter. That's the trade-off. That's the Sex Party's trade-off for the vote on the bill. Okay,
that's how to have unvaxxed sex work. I bet you're not allowed to be a sex worker if you're unvaxxed. Surely not.
Damo, you're a terror.
I want to thank the both of you for coming on and doing this. As I've sat here doing the comments, everyone's in shock. There'll be another big march this weekend. Hopefully, it'll be even bigger than last week's one was, and last week's one was enormous. All this week, people will be on the steps of the Parliament House. We call them the Steps of Solace, going there too. I think there is lots of things to do. I actually feel contacting or even protesting outside the House of the parliamentarians who in the upper house who are going to vote this through. I think that's actually a good place to protest. Sit outside the house.
Yeah.
Look, I think if I can say, there are places, and look, I can send Michael and Damien the references to these websites where people can go and have a look. So I think in terms of, because people keep asking, what can I do? So first of all, make sure that everybody is informed. So many people have no idea what's coming, absolutely no idea. You know, the timing of this is extraordinary. You know, we're talking about a time when everyone's come out of lockdown, when regional Victoria has become accessible, where we're talking to races, we're talking people wanting to go and just, you know, just switch off. I mean, we've had, you know, a long time of just heartache. I mean, people don't want to even bother with this. They don't realize how important this piece of legislation is. So I think at first place is people educating and, you know, telling other people and explaining it to them, and then sending them to reliable websites where they can read up on it themselves and make up their mind. The other thing too that they need to also do is then take the next step and take action. And action means, look, protests are not for everybody. You know, writing letters to politicians is not for everybody. So I think there are a multitude of things that people can do.
Ring up your politicians. Ring them up for a start.
Ring them up. Write letters to them. Write emails to them.
Email them. Ring them.
One is a Labor
One at
member.
a time, guys.
Yeah. She's stood against the Labor Party before. Jane Garrett. She was the Minister for Human Services in 2016, and she stood against Daniel Andrews when he was trying to overtake the Country Fire Authority over with the Firefighters Union, because he wanted to get more paid members work in the voluntary organisation, and they kicked up against him. Jane Garrett stood by the CFA against Daniel Andrews. This doesn't happen. She did. She lost her job as a result of it, so she took the hits for it. She's now a member of the Labor Party in the upper house. The vote at the moment is 18-17. Now, this is a long shot, but I reckon this is a woman that somewhere voted on conscience and took.
Let's bring her on the show. Let's get her on the show.
Yeah. And I think James, that'd be a great idea. And I think she's worth
there are still
lose. It just needs one person to flip, and this legislation is lost.
Yeah.
Lost.
There are still Labor members in the upper house that, you know, are there for true Labor values, and they are not necessarily the values that the current government stands for, unfortunately. So it's those members that, you know, we need to contact. It's those members we need to have the conversations with. Community groups, like any kind of community group, you know, if they speak out on behalf of their members. I think there is a lot of people, and particularly in Australia, we kind of live in a political apathy here, because we've had it for so long, so good. We tend to trust
everyone's motivated. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but you know, people need to be told what they can do, because they've never had to do this in the past. You know, not on this scale.
No, you're
so
right.
I think the more people understand that until it's actually voted on in, you know, probably about 2 weeks' time.
9 days.
Yeah, less than
well,
2.
they go back on the 16th. They'll be deliberating on it probably for a couple of days. So, you know, the pressure is on. The time to act is now. But every single person can do something.
And I say again to all Australians, remember, I'm an immigrant here, just like Meta. I'm saying to every person here, guys, she won't be right. She won't be right.
Exactly.
And also, I'll tell you another thing.
You're fitting right in, Gary. You're fitting right in.
And I'll tell you one other thing. You won't. You're not all right, Jack. It's not I'm all right, Jack. No, you're not all right, Jack. You are not going to be able to hide from this. They're coming after you, just like the rest of us. I'm telling you, they're going to come after. They'll get the easy ones first. They'll get Michael and Damo because they're troublemakers, and they'll rub out